Welcome to Module 5, Stress, Flourishing, and Health. Well, you've made it this far. That's pretty good. I'm starting with a quote from Plato. If you want to see a child at his very best in learning all the important things in life, watch him at play. So I'm beginning with the end, in that really this quote kind of captures the idea of flourishing. And as we'll see, the main point is that you don't have to live a life of stress, but in fact flourishing is a way in which to control stress or put it on the back burner, so to speak. But it's not easy. So these lectures really are designed to be somewhat short and sweet, so to speak, because this is a very complex area, as are, of course, all the areas that we've been discussing in K&H 329 Health Psychology. But the basic idea of these lectures: there's 5 readings, 10 through 14, as you can see here on the screen, and in the lecture notes. We have 2 readings that really pound into stress, reading 10, reading 11, and then readings 12, 13, and 14 are more on the idea of flourishing. So in these lectures, and again, I'm not sure how many there will be, but we're going to try to, in this first lecture, capture what the immune system is and what the stress systems are, and they of course go together, as you'll see. And I'm guessing that'll be the first lecture covering these 2 sections, sections 1 and 2, and then we'll probably have one more lecture that will cover 3 and 4. I'm hoping I can kind of keep this short and sweet, but keep in mind, immune system, very complex; stress system, very complex; and stress and the immune system relationship, even more complex, which is why we have this word called psychoneuroimmunology. Captures 3 different body systems, human systems, that work together related to this whole idea. Your main task, because the final exam, basically the only exam, exam 1, focuses on that relationship between stress and the immune system, and how flourishing can kind of buffer or change that relationship. So you need to understand the basics of the immune system, the basics of the stress-immune system relationship, and then how flourishing can kind of connect to that. A couple of assignments or learning activities in this section. The movie Stress, Portrait of a Killer relates to your personal connection paper number 5. This is about a 45-minute documentary on stress, covering Dr. Sapolsky, who's a researcher out of Stanford. I won't give you too many more details. You can watch that movie. It's outstanding. We'll really give you the basics of some of the stress-immune system relationship. So let's get to it in terms of the basics of the immune system. And I'm talking about very basics. Immunity is the body's resistance to harm from invading organisms. The very basic immune response, and I'm just going to give you a figure here to kind of help us understand this. Basically, you have a foreign body that enters our system. That typically is an antigen. It can be anything relating to a virus, infection, whatever it might be. What happens is our white blood cells, right, in this case a phagocyte, engulfs that agent and degrades the proteins. That's called phagocytosis, right? So then this white blood cell that has engulfed this antigen, of course there's many of these going on at the same time, right? They're also known, these white blood cells are also known as dendritic cells. And just to kind of make sure you understand that this is really complex, a guy, Dr. Steinman, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, Dr. Steinman won the Nobel Prize for discovering dendritic cells, and unfortunately passed away a few days before he won the Nobel Prize, Dr. Ralph Steinman. And again, Dr. Steinman was recognized for his 1973 co-discovery of dendritic cells, which play a vital role in helping the immune system destroy intruders. So keep in mind, 1973, not many years ago, 40 years or so ago, was when these dendritic cells were discovered. And to show you how science works, at first when he co-discovered these dendritic cells, most researchers thought it was just a bunch of hooey. So just to show you, there's some people out there who have done some really cool things relating to the immune system. So you have these dendritic cells, and they communicate with these helper cells, and how they do that is through what's called interferons. These are proteins that help immune cells communicate with each other. So it's a fascinating system. Dendritic cells, through phagocytosis, engulf the antigen. The antigen-presenting cell then calls out to the helper cells, "Help! Help!" through these interferons, and these helper cells then kick into action NK cells, natural killer cells, other T-type cells, B cells, kills the foreign agent and the infective cells. These are also sometimes known as lymphocytes. And then importantly, down here on the right, you have what's called memory cells, and your body kind of remembers this whole action so that if it happens again, it's more efficient and will remember. Very basic of the immune system in terms of how it works. It's a very beautiful system when it works properly. Unfortunately, for many people, it seems to go haywire here, and then we'll get into that in a moment. But that's the basics. Phagocytosis, dendritic cells call out to the helper cells, "Help! Help!" through interferons, which connect dendritic cells to the helper cells. The helper cells connect to lymphocytes, who then are kind of the key action cells, in that they kill these infected cells, and you get rid of the infection or the virus or whatever it might be. And that's how it works. Very basics of the immune system. Now, things can go haywire. Unfortunately, I've experienced this, as well as millions of others have, through what's called autoimmunity, a specific humoral or cell-mediated immune response that attacks the body's own tissues. Not a good thing. So, for example, with my autoimmune condition, Sjogren's, they attack the salivary glands. So the salivary glands, if they're attacked, you can lose some of them, you lose their function, and you end up with dry eyes, dry mouth, for example, right? And that's how it works with a lot of different kinds of autoimmune conditions. Why? There's really no consensus on this. It is very complex. You can read up a little bit more on autoimmune conditions if you're interested, from reading 11 on page 349 to find out a little bit more about it. But basically, what happens is the body fails to recognize its own tissues and attacks the healthy ones, not the antigens, but attacks the healthy cells. So you're attacking, your good cells are attacking your good cells because they're interpreted as a foreign invader or an antigen. So you make a mistake, you make an error. Now what you'll see is that stress can exacerbate this process or kick it off in some way. So with autoimmune conditions, the body produces antibodies when you don't need them. So you got all these antibodies running around, and they don't know what to do, so they end up killing the good cells. It's typically preceded or activated by some kind of viral infections, and it's a very interactive thing, which would relate right to our biopsychosocial theme throughout this course: genetics times environment, or genetics interacting with the environment seems to lead to some kind of autoimmune condition for some people. Now, psychoneuroimmunology also kind of was an interactive word that was developed around in the 70s and 80s, as well, as we began to understand that this whole process is very complex, and there's three systems involved: the neural, the endocrine, and the immune system. They all work together. Again, this is relatively new in terms of this interactive approach to understanding immune system. A while back, they used to thought that these systems worked alone. It is now known these systems do interact together. So the nervous system relates to the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. And again, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on these systems. That would take a lot more than I know, to be honest, and would be just another class. There may be classes here at Miami that get into more detail on this, and you may have had some of those, especially if you're probably kinesiology major. But you have the nervous system, the endocrine system, which is the hormonal system, and the immune system. And all of these relate together in very intricate ways. So basically, the nervous system can affect the immune system and vice versa. And not to give you too many words here, but this is from reading number 11, page 347. And we'll get into these stress systems in a minute, but just to kind of give you kind of what's coming. Stress which we'll find out what stress is in a little bit as well. Stress engages the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis. These are both of the stress systems, which we'll get into in a minute, both of which influence immune function. So the sympathetic activation in response to stress has immediate effects of increasing immune activity, especially natural killer cell activity. And stress-related changes in hypothalamic adrenal cortical functioning have immunosuppressive effects. So here's where we get into stress relating to suppressing our immune system, and it's mostly through that adrenal system, the hormonal systems, and that they release things like glucocorticoids, cortisol, reduces the number of white blood cells, which means you can't function, affects the functioning of lymphocytes, and reduces the release of cytokines, which can reduce the ability of these substances to signal and communicate with other aspects of the immune system. Again, you can see how this is very complex, but you're getting into stress, which you'll see is very much a psychological experience or a biopsychosocial experience. That stress can then lead to effects on the HPA axis, which is a stress system, which then releases certain hormones, which, if over a long period of time, these hormones, such as cortisol, suppress our immune system, which is not good, right? Because then you're at risk for all kinds of bad stuff happening. So basically, the nervous system can affect the immune system. So hopefully you're getting the idea that this is a very rich, kind of complex topic that you're on right now. So let's start off a little bit. We've got a few minutes left in this lecture. The basics of stress and the stress systems. Right? Stress seems to kick off some of this process. So what is it? Well, importantly, you need to understand that there's stressors and there's stress. And the stressor is just a potentially stressful event. But a stressor alone cannot fully explain your experience of stress. Why? Because for some people, for example, an exam, a final exam, let's say, can be a stressor, which leads to experiences of stress, whereas for some, it can be perceived as more of a challenge and really wouldn't kick off a stress response. So stressor is just something in the environment. It's an event that is waiting to happen or has happened. Now, stress is very much, from what the literature suggests, is a negative emotional experience accompanied by holistic bodily changes directed to all effects. So by definition, stress is a negative emotional experience, usually kicked off by a stressor of some kind, and they're all going to be different for different people. So you got stressor and stress, important to understand, and then you have stress results from the process of appraising and experience the event. So it all depends on how you appraise the stressor, right? How does your body and mind react to this stressor? Appraising events or potential events primarily determines responses and experiences. Importantly, the stress research has come a long way. It's not just a stressor. In the past, they used to have all these events which they would consider stressors and would equate them as stress. But we're finding out more and more that that's not the case. You have a stressor, and then the mind appraises or interprets that event or coming event, right, as being potentially stressful. And once the stress system kicks in, that's when a lot of this stuff begins to happen. And what I do is I think I'll stop here and start the next lecture in Module 5, Lecture 2, where we'll get into the two stress systems, the sympathetic adrenomedullary and the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. You can see how people spend their lives studying these things, and they are complex. But hopefully you got an understanding of the basics of the immune system and the basics, a little bit of the basics of stressors and stress from this first lecture.